Quote, "The sleep of reason brings forth monsters." Francisco Goya. Historians may well remember the 20th century as the age of world wars, nuclear weapons, and a new kind of political regime, totalitarianism. All of these developments are connected to political ideologies in one way or another, but none more closely than totalitarianism. For totalitarianism is the attempt to make complete control of a society. It is not just its governments, but all of its social, cultural, and economic institutions, in order to fulfill an ideological vision of how society ought to be organized and how life ought to be lived. This is what happened in the Soviet Union when Stalin imposed his version of Marxist socialism on that country. It is also what happened in Italy and Germany when Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler introduced varieties of a new and openly totalitarian ideology called fascism. In fact, Mussolini and the Italian fascists coined the word totalitarian. They did this to define their revolutionary aims and to distinguish their ideology from liberalism and socialism, which they saw as defenders of democracy. Democracy requires equality of some sort, whether it be in the liberals' insistence on equal opportunity for individuals or in the socialists' insistence on equal power for all in a classless society. Mussolini and his followers regarded these ideals with contempt, as did Hitler and the Nazis. They did appeal to the masses for support, to be sure, but in their view, the masses were to exercise power not by thinking, speaking, or voting for themselves, but by blindly following their leaders to glory. And as one of Mussolini's many slogans put it, credere, obedere, combattere. Believe, obey, fight. Nothing more was asked, nothing more was desired of the people. By embracing totalitarianism, then fascists also rejected democracy. In this respect, fascism is a reactionary ideology. It took shape in the years following the Great War as a creation against the two leading ideologies of the time, that of liberalism and socialism. Unhappy with the liberal emphasis on the individual and with the socialist emphasis on contending social classes, the fascists provided a new view of the world in which individuals and classes were to be absorbed into an all-embracing whole, a mighty nation under the control of a single party and a supreme leader. Like the reactionaries of the early 19th century, they also rejected the faith in reason that they thought formed the foundation for both liberalism and socialism. Reason is less reliable, both Mussolini and Hitler declared, than institutions and emotions, what we sometimes call gut instincts. To say that fascism is in some ways a reactionary ideology is not to say, however, that fascists are simply reactionaries or extreme conservatives. In many ways, they are quite different. Unlike Joseph de Maistre and the other reactionaries, for instance, fascists do not reject democracy, liberalism, and socialism in order to turn the clock back to a time when society was rooted in ascribed status, with church king and aristocracy firmly in power. On the contrary, many fascists have been openly hostile to religion, and a few of them have had any respect for hereditary monarchs and aristocrats. Nor have they sought to return to the old, established ways of life. On the contrary, fascism in its most distinctive forms has been openly revolutionary, eager not only to change society, but to change it dramatically. This revolutionary fervor by itself sets fascists apart from conservatives, who cannot abide rapid and radical change. So too does the fascist plan to concentrate power in the hands of a totalitarian state led by a single party and a supreme leader. Nothing could be further from the conservatives' desire to disperse power among various levels of government and the other little platoons that make up what they take to be a healthy society than the fascist vision of a unified state, bending to the will of a single, all-powerful leader. Fascism, then, is neither conservative nor simply reactionary. It is, as the original fascists boasted about, a new and distinctive ideology. To appreciate how distinctive it is, we need to explore its background in the counter-enlightenment and nationalism. And then, in other intellectual currents of the 19th century, we shall then examine fascism in its purest form in Mussolini's Italy, following that with a look at other varieties of fascism in Nazi Germany, as well as elsewhere. Concerning the historical background of fascism, although it did not emerge as a political ideology until the 1920s, its roots reach back to 2 centuries to the reaction against the intellectual and cultural movement that dominated European thought in the 18th century, that of the Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. The thinkers of the Age of Reason dreamed of a dream of reason, taking the scientific discoveries of the 17th and 18th centuries respectively as their model and inspiration. The Enlightenment philosophers claimed that the application of reason could remove all the social and political evils that stood in the way of happiness and progress. Reason can light the minds of men and women, they proclaimed, freeing them from ignorance and error and superstition as well. The two great political currents that flow from the Enlightenment are liberalism and socialism, of course, but different as they are in other respects, these two ideologies are alike in sharing the premises of the Enlightenment. These premises included 1. Human, or humanism, the idea that human beings are the source and measure of value, with human life valuable in and of itself. As Immanuel Kant, who lived from 1724 to 1804, put it, human beings belong to the kingdom of ends. Each person is an end in himself, not something that others may use, like a tool, as a means of accomplishing their own selfish ends. The second out of 5 is rationalism, the idea that human beings are rational creatures and that human reason, epitomized in scientific inquiry, can solve all mysteries and reveal solutions to all the problems that men and women face in the human world of history. The third is secularism, the idea that religion may be a source of comfort and insight, psychologically speaking, but not of absolute and unquestionable truth for guiding public life. The Enlightenment thinkers differed from one another in their religious views. Some, like John Locke and Immanuel Kant, remained Christians, although many unorthodox in their views. Of course, many people at the time were religious. Majority of the people, very few people, were not. Of course, others like Voltaire, who lived from the end of the 17th century to the around the end of the 18th century, rejected Christianity but believed in a God who had created a world as well as ordered an ordered society, such as one that is well ordered as a watch, which the divine watchmaker, he once had coined, had round and left to run. Still others were atheists, but of course that's just a deistic view. But then those who took their religion seriously regarded it as something to be confined largely to private life, and therefore out of place in politics. The irreligious among the Enlightenment philosophers simply dismissed religion, of course, as an outmoded superstition that indeed must give way to rational and scientific ideas. And so, of course, as we just mentioned, Voltaire from 1694 to 1778 had rejected Christianity. He did, however, believe in God. He was a deist. He believed in a created world. Of course, that was before the time of the 19th century, and he saw the created world as a well-ordered, and he saw it as well-ordered as a watch. Fourth, we have progressivism, which is the idea that human history is the story of progress or improvement, perhaps even inevitable improvement in the human condition. Once the shackles of ignorance and superstition have been broken, human reason will be free to order society in a rational way, and life will steadily and rapidly become better for all. And then the fifth is universalism, the idea that there is a single universal human nature that binds all human beings together. Despite the differences of race, culture, or religious creed, human beings are all equal members of Kant's kingdom of ends, who share in the same essential nature, including preeminently the capacity for reason, of course. Now, however, we know that we were all apes and all come from the same lineage and common ancestor. These Enlightenment views are often linked to liberalism, but they provide much of the inspiration for socialism as well. Indeed, modern socialism arose in part from the complaint that liberalism was not doing far enough in its attempt to remake society in the image of Enlightenment ideals. Fascism, however, grows out of the very different conviction that the ideals of the Enlightenment are not worth pursuing, a claim first put forward in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And of course, you have fascism propelled by romanticism on a national level, and of course that is nationalism. The encounter enlightenment. Concerning the counter enlightenment, a diverse group of thinkers, some call a counter enlightenment mounted on an attack on the Enlightenment. Among them were the linguist Johann Gottfried von Herder, from 1744 to 1803, the royalists and reactionaries Joseph de Maistre, which we've mentioned earlier, 1753 to 1821, and Louis Gabriel de Bonald, 1754 to 1840, the Marquis de Sade, 1740 to 1814, now notorious as a libertine and pornographer, and racial theorists like Joseph Arthur de Gobineau, 1816 and 1882. None of them rejected every premise of the Enlightenment. Each had particular concerns and complaints that the others did not share, but they were alike in dismissing the major premises of the Enlightenment as fanciful, false, and politically dangerous. These counter-Enlightenment thinkers were united, however, for instance, in denouncing universalism as a myth. Human beings are not all alike, they said. The differences that distinguish groups of people from one another run very deep. Indeed, these differences of sex, race, language, culture, creed, and nationality actually define who and what people are, shaping how they think of themselves and other people. And I agree to some degree or another, but for some of the counter-Enlightenment thinkers stressed differences of one kind, while others focused on other kinds. You have to think at this time, they thought that if you could just perfect everything in science, that one day the world would be extremely perfect, or that we would be able to understand every single thing that can ever possibly be understood. Now we don't think that way. So, for example, for Herder, linguistic and cultural differences mattered most of all. For Gobineau, it was race, and for de Sade, it was gender. Men do not admit women to the kingdom of ends. They treat them as means, as objects to be used, abused, and humiliated. And as sad as this may be, some people have thought that this is all it should be. Fittingly, our words sadism and sadist, as well as sadistic, come from the name de Sade. The counter-Enlightenment critics brought similar complaints against the Enlightenment's faith in reason. The problem with rationalism, they said, is that it flies in the face of all human experience. The prevalence of unreason, or not reason, of superstition and prejudice, fear and lies, shows that reason itself is too weak to be relied on. Most people, most of the time, use reason not to examine matters critically and dispassionately, but to rationalize and excuse their desires and deepen their prejudices. With this in mind, the counter-Enlightenment writers often deplored the Enlightenment's assault on religion. However, some of them wrote from sincere religious conviction, but others, however, simply held that religious beliefs are socially necessary fictions. The belief in heaven and hell, they maintained, may be all that keeps most people behaving as well as they actually do. To lose that belief may be to lose all hope of a civilized and ordered society again, with the debasement and devaluation of all values. If that means that government must support an established church and to persecute dissenters, then so be it. In different ways, each of these critics challenged the fundamental premises of the Enlightenment. Out of their challenge, a different picture of human beings emerged out of the Age of Reason. According to this picture, humans are fundamentally non-rational, even irrational beings, as they are defined by their differences of race, sex, religion, language, and nationality, and they are usually locked into conflict with one another, a conflict sparked by their deep-seated and probably permanent differences. Taken one by one, there is nothing necessarily fascist about any element of this picture. Combining the elements, however, produces a picture of human capacities and characteristics that prepared the way for the emergence of fascism. This picture should become clearer as we look at another feature of fascism that I have mentioned before, that of nationalism. Next, we will discuss nationalism, and then we'll go start to read about fascism in Italy. We'll go over some of the theories of fascism as well as some of the actual practices of it.